Good morning, everybody. So my name's Julie Barn. I'm the employment partner here at Sharpe, and today in this Short Mind session, Kit is going to be covering the latest changes to employment law as proposed or have already come in or are imminent from the Labour government. And I'm just going to pass you over swiftly to Kit to start that.
Thanks for that, Julie. So just to check, can you see the slides okay?
I can.
Wonderful. Yeah, so my name's Kit Grayson. I'm an associate in the employment department at Sharpe. This is obviously a very hot topic at the moment, and the idea of this webinar is it's going to hopefully be a little bit shorter than usual, and I'm going to whip through changes in the law that has already been brought into place, what we can expect imminently, and a bit of horizon scanning, this new Labour government, what they've announced and what we can expect. Yeah, so I'll be framing the context, looking at Conservative government changes which are already in force and changes brought in by the Conservative government which will be imminently taking effect. And as I mentioned, some of this Labour new proposals. We'll also be closing by thinking about how your organisations at this stage can start to manage this raft of new changes within employment law. So before I get into some of the dry law, I think it's helpful to frame the context that we're operating in. So of course, Labour came to power in July of this year. And as part of that, a large part of their manifesto is an improvement to employer and worker protection within employment law. Some of these changes have been announced and the reaction has been divisive. No awards for guessing which one of these headlines belongs to The Guardian and which one belongs to the Daily Mail. So are we going to see a new era in employment law where there's far stronger protection and employers are, have to work far harder to protect their staff? Or is it fair to characterize some of these changes as, as the Daily Mail put there, a work shy charter? So in this first stage, we'll start to consider law which is already in place and your organizations should already be implementing. And the first one is changes to flexible working. So there's been an amendment to the Employment Rights Act, and this took effect in April of this year. The change includes that an employee can make 2 flexible work requests in a 12-month period, and the deadline to respond has been reduced from 3 months to 2 months. There's now an obligation that you as the employer will need to consult that employee if you're considering rejecting their request. And it's also removing the need for employees to explain or justify the impact of the proposed change on their working arrangements. So this will become a day one entitlement, and it will remove the previous requirement that there had to be 26 weeks of continuous service before they could make that request. And finally, potentially most importantly for you as employers defending these claims, are that they can bring a claim in the Employment Tribunal for a breach of this new Flexible Working Act. However, it can't be a freestanding claim. It would have to be accompanied with another claim in the Employment Tribunal. Helpfully, sorry, Julie.
So I was just going to ask Kit, in terms of the 2-month deadline, is that to complete the process or just respond to the initial point? Because I think that is often the area that we see where the current provisions are breached, in that employers just aren't able to manage that process within the period.
Yeah, that's a good question, Julie. I believe it's the deadline is to respond for the employer to consider the employer's request in that 2-month period, and so that's going to be even more challenging now. So with this added consultation requirement, if you are thinking of rejecting it, that's going to have to be fitted in within that 2-month time period. Obviously, there is a little bit of flexibility if there are very good reasons that you can articulate for why you're going to be outside of those 2 months, then potentially there might be some flexibility. But ultimately, as Julie's correctly identified, you're going to really need to be acting quite promptly to ensure you're complying with this new requirement. So helpfully for you as the employer, at the same time this new legislative change, ACAS revised their code of practice for flexible working. So at the start, it's just a reminder of the formal requirements that you need for an employee to make that request. So it needs to include the data request, the change in the terms and conditions. So what flexible working are they actually requesting? The date that the employee would like it to come into effect, and if the employee has made a request before. I've pulled out a few particular sections from this code, which I believe are of relevance. So employers must handle every request in a reasonable manner. This should include carefully assessing the effect of the requested change for both the employer and the employee, such as the potential benefits of benefits or other impacts of accepting or rejecting it. When you read this in conjunction with the bit below, so employers must agree to a flexible working request unless there is a genuine business reason not to. What we're seeing is a far stronger requirement and a switching in the onus. So previously, employers, if we're honest, it might actually be that quite often flexible work requests are met with skepticism. It's quite difficult to balance in a busy team sometimes. However, the onus now is on you as an employer. You must agree to that request. If you're not going to agree to it, then one, you've consulted with that employee, but two, you can articulate and you can communicate to that employee the very strong, genuine business reason that you're not going to accept that request. So the reasons remain the same that you can provide. So is it going to result in additional cost? Is there an inability for your organization to reorganize work around that request? Are you unable to recruit to support it? Is it going to have a detrimental impact on quality, performance, or meeting customer demand? Is there insufficient work available to accommodate the request? And finally, are there any planned structural changes that might mean the request can't be accepted at that point in time? So, and finally, unless the employer decides to agree to the employee's written request in full, they must consult. So what we're seeing, as I've said, real strengthening of the right to flexible working, and really you need to be considering this ACAS code so that you're managing them effectively. Again, I want to sort of frame this development, which, yeah, go on, Julie.
Sorry to butt in again. I think in terms of the reasons, we often see, one of the key areas where people are requesting flexible work now is the ability to work from home. And it's been COVID pandemic and all the restrictions and forcing everyone to work from home has made it much harder for employers to say, no, it's not feasible. And so when you're putting forward your reasons, you can't just say, oh, can't reorganize work. You're going to have to put some substance behind these points. So you can't just say, oh, it'll cost us more. What do you mean by that? And explain how you've reached that decision. So it's not a fact that you can just rely on one of these reasons and say that, well, that's enough. You've got to actually be able to show that that is the reason you've got. And I think in terms of a lot of our local authority, clients have mandatory and other people have mandatory hybrid working policies where they have to come in at certain times, and they've got reasons why they've brought that in. We haven't seen yet whether those sorts of reasons in terms of not presenteeism but being within the community and those sort of the desirability of working within the community that you're intending to serve is sufficient as a business reason. But I think it's something that you're going to have to work around, and if possible, always try and reach a compromise. Thanks, Kit. Sorry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Julie's right. Since COVID lockdown, and there has been a real shift in the dynamic and how flexible working is perceived. And most recently, we've seen an even, I'd say the tone has shifted again. So as we came out of COVID and we're still in the Conservative government, there were real steps taken, and there was, it was played out in the media, staff should be back at work, and Julie was mentioning sort of there are good reasons for that, particularly in public sector organisations. Um, However, in recent days, we've seen that the Labour government has relaxed the 3-day office working rules for civil servants. Employment law, whilst yes, you need to apply the law as it applies to your organisation, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And what we're seeing in the dynamic at the moment is a real strengthening in flexible work requests and a perception that supporting staff by allowing them to be able to work from home, to potentially work a condensed working week, so 5 days over 4 days. We're really seeing a move towards that, and that should be considered in your organization, and how these requests may have been received and actioned, and how they might be received moving forward. So another change which is already brought in relates to pregnancy and family leave connected to um, a redundancy situation. So previously, the law on redundancy was that employees on maternity leave, shared parental leave, or adoption leave already had special protection. So in a redundancy scenario, they would have to be offered a suitable alternative vacancy if if one was available before being made redundant. And what we're seeing in this new legislative change is a massive expansion of the time limit when that special protection arises. So the right of first refusal for vacancies is being extended beyond the period of maternity, adoption, parental leave for a further 18 months. Similarly, the protection against redundancy will now begin on the day the employer is notified of the pregnancy and ends 18 months after the child's birth. And the final point there is 18-month extension also applies to an employee taking 6 weeks consecutive shared parental leave. Now, if any of your organizations are going through a redundancy situation, often the difficult bit to balance is, someone that is on maternity leave, and that situation is going to be even more delicate and have to be considered further whenever you're conducting these redundancy processes. Because the time period is being expanded by such great extent, this really needs to be factored into your planning stages and continuing afterwards. Yes, Julie.
I think it's also worth highlighting that this isn't giving anybody protection against redundancies. So if you follow your redundancy process and somebody who is pregnant or on maternity leave or within this extended period is genuinely selected for redundancy, then this gives them a right to ring fence for alternative roles that are suitable for them. So it doesn't give them a right not to be selected for redundancy in the first place. I think that's a really important point. I'm not saying you select someone in the first place for that reason, but it's just something to bear in mind.
Definitely. Other changes which are already in force include the changes to carers leave and paternity leave. So employees are now entitled to 1 week of unpaid leave for each year if they have caring responsibilities. Within this webinar, I'm not going to go too much into the specifics, but there are specific requirements which would enable employees to be eligible for this right. For example, the caring has to be for a dependent, i.e. spouse, civil partner, etc. And whilst it is a day one right, it applies to someone that has a long-term care need. So it wouldn't necessarily be applicable to periods of short-term caring responsibilities. And moving on, there's also paternity leave. So there's an expansion of the paternity rights. Employees can take statutory paternity leave, and they can split their 2-week entitlement into 2 separate 1-week blocks rather than having to take them together. Equally, they're no longer required to take it within 8 weeks of the child's birth, and it can be any time within that first year of the child's birth. Finally, the notice requirement that the employee would have to give to you as the employer has been cut down from 15 weeks to only 28 days. So if I were to summarize the legislative changes that are already in force, we're seeing quite a big expansion in employees' rights. And there's a few things in there that could trip you up if you haven't thought about them in some of your policies and processes that you're following right now. So that's law that is already in force, and hopefully your organisation's already accounting for and factoring in. What we're also seeing is law which has been passed through Parliament but hasn't yet come into force. And the absolute key one, and I'm sure will be on everyone's radar that's attending this call, is the new Preventing Workplace Sexual Harassment and the Worker Protection, i.e. Amendment of Equality Act 2010. So this act was passed in October of last year, and it's going to come into effect in almost exactly a month's time. We've already had a very detailed webinar on this topic covered by my colleague David, and within the slides I've linked to that webinar. These slides will be circulated not long after this this webinar, and so you'll be able to get access to for the price of one. So I'm going to just do a high-level summary just as a refresher of this new sexual harassment duty, just because it's so important. So the new law, if we're to summarize it, is it's now placing a duty on you as the employer to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. A failure to comply with this new duty means that a tribunal will be able to increase the compensation by up to 25%. And really, the focus of this new sexual harassment law is it's attempting to shift the focus from redress to prevention. It really is going to be a proactive duty now, whereas the law focused previously on, okay, an act of sexual harassment has taken place. What had you done as an employer to prevent it? It's now going a lot further, and it's saying you have a real proactive duty to be thinking about and taking measures positively to prevent sexual harassment taking place within your organization. So the previous law is you as an employer would be vicariously liable for the acts of your employees if they commit an act of discrimination or harassment, so including sexual harassment. However, you as the employer would be able to rely on an all reasonable steps defense, and that is if you as the employer had done everything within your control and you could evidence that you'd sought to prevent and taken measures to stop that act of harassment taking place, then you may have a defense to the claim against your organization. Speaking about this current new duty though, I think it's important to recognize that actually previously the duty was going to be far larger. It actually sought to ban third person harassment. However, that has now been removed from the law. I think whilst everyone on this call can agree it is good that there is law out there to protect staff from sexual harassment, I think particularly thinking about public sector organisations where you're frequently in contact with members of the public and managing quite difficult situations, had there been a duty to prevent third person harassment, I think that would have placed a lot of organisations in quite a difficult position to manage practically on the ground. I've explained already you're now under this new positive duty, so it's not looking back, it's looking forward and what measures you're taking to prevent it. Crucially, this won't be a new freestanding claim. So an employer can't look at the acts you're doing and say, you're not doing enough. I'm going to take this to an employment tribunal. Unfortunately, the employer will have to have suffered an act of discrimination or harassment, and then they'll be able to argue that you, as the employer, have breached this duty, and the tribunal should increase the award to reflect that. Yes, Julie.
I was just also going to point out that when this bill went through Parliament, the other part that was watered down was this positive duty. So you can see at the top of the slide, the current responsibility for, in terms of vicarious liability, is all reasonable steps. And now the positive duty going forward is the employers are required to take reasonable steps. And so it will be more about you explaining what's reasonable in your organisation in terms of the size, the context, etc., to take reasonable steps, rather in terms of vicarious liability. All reasonable steps covers everything that you might not have thought of, but the tribunal think is reasonable 12 months down the line. So I think that is also something to factor in. I'm not saying you don't put as much effort into making those reasonable steps, but I think it's something you should take some comfort that this isn't going to be something that can you as an organisation can be flogged with, even though you've tried your best.
That's definitely right, Julie. And so this has been a real hot topic, and so I'm aware that many people on this call will already be thinking about what policies and actions are in place within your organisation. But it is of course helpful to frame that and think about this law's coming into force shortly. Are we ready for it? So we've now looked at what law is in force or will imminently be brought into force, and that reflects Conservative government changes. We're now going to look ahead at the Labour government and what may be in store for organisations and employment law developments moving forward. So prior to the general election, Labour published the plan to make work pay. I think this document could be summarised as really their employment law manifesto. Labour described this document as potentially the biggest upgrade to rights at work for a generation. And within this manifesto, it set out a number of proposals to employment law and changes that they wish to take forward. Shortly after taking power, we had the King's Speech on the 17th of July, and it was announced within the King's Speech that this new employment rights bill will go forward, as well as a draft equality, race and disability bill. Labour has continued to state that this employment rights bill, i.e., where we're going to see all these radical changes, will be introduced to Parliament within 100 days of taking power. Those of you that subscribe to and get the many emails from Daniel Barnett, is he made the prediction this week that bills aren't published on a Saturday, and Friday is normally reserved for PMBs, which means if the bill is published on the last day of the 100-day period, which is likely given the political wrangling going on, it will probably be on Thursday, the 10th of October. And so I think it is helpful to have this webinar now. Your organizations are looking ahead at what you can expect. And so when there is this announcement in October, you'll be well placed to already be thinking about, okay, these are the steps that we need to be thinking about and actions to take moving forward. So included within the Employment Rights Bill are some really headline grabbing changes, none more so than the day one rights. So parental leave, sick pay and unfair dismissal protection to become day one rights. Out of those, the one that's going to cause alarm bells to start sounding is, of course, unfair dismissal becoming a day one right. As everyone on this call will know, there currently is a 2-year qualifying service for someone to bring an unfair dismissal claim. Frequently, we're asked to advise on dismissals and managing risk for your organisations, and quite often what we've got to think about is, okay, have they got 2 years service? Is there a risk of discrimination? If neither of those are at play, then quite often we categorize the dismissal as very low risk and they can proceed. That's going to be completely shaken up by this change if it is introduced. Uh, if an employee can bring an unfair dismissal claim from day one, then that's going to really increase the amount of claims brought against organisations. However, whilst the detail hasn't fully been provided at this stage, Labour have said that probationary periods are likely to have a special status. Exactly how this special status will operate, we don't fully know at this stage. However, I think we can speculate that whilst unfair dismissal will become a day one right, we can expect stronger controls and a greater tolerance within an effectively managed probationary period. And it's something I'll touch on a bit more when we think about, okay, what can your organisation do to manage these risks? Another change that we've seen announced relates to 0 hours contracts. So it's not going to be an outright ban. However, there will be a real radical change in how these contracts can be used. So anyone working regular hours or a shift pattern for 12 weeks or more will gain the right to a regular contract reflecting the hours they work. All workers will get reasonable notice of any change in any shifts, excuse me, or working time, and will be remunerated for any cancelled shifts. So 0 hours contracts are not frequently used too much. It relates to potentially specific service areas of local authorities if they were to be used. But again, these are some big changes that you'll need to be mindful of. We're also seeing proposals to replace what Labour has described as an inadequate code of practice on dismissal and re-engagement with a stronger one. So if we think back to 2022, we saw the widely reported P&O sackings where they effectively fired all their staff and said, you will offer you new contracts on massively reduced terms, which were less favourable to those staff. It caused obviously uproar within the UK and led to the Conservative government introducing this statutory code on fire and rehire. So what Labour's saying is this code doesn't go far enough, and actually they want an even stronger one. But it's important to note that the code doesn't directly ban the practice of fire and rehire, but implements a number of key guidelines to ensure a fair process is followed when agreeing contractual changes. I've spoken about this code before in Sharpe Minds, and I just reiterate, large public sector organisations, I'm aware that fire and rehire will remain an absolute last resort. A lot of the requirements introduced within the code, i.e., enhanced consultation, the fact that it's a last resort, the risk of an increased remedy if you don't comply with it. These are all things that I think large public sector organisations already account for in your processes. But what you need to think is this code is being strengthened. And so if you are going through a restructure process and it reaches this last resort, you do consider that code and you're mindful of, if it hasn't been brought out yet, that code's only going to be strengthened. Yeah, just some other points I didn't quite mention that. So it cannot be used as a threat of dismissal or a negotiation tactic, and the unions need to be really carefully consulted and brought into any proposed changes. Finally, some other changes we can expect to see from the Employment Rights Bill include the setting up of a Fair Work Agency. So I think the intention is this will be an independent organisation that will sit not as a central government operation, but its own agency, and it will monitor working conditions and employment rights within employers. I think the distinction there is currently the employment tribunal polices claims that have been brought to it. So if an employee has had their working conditions or breach of employment law, they go to the tribunal to seek redress. This new agency will be more proactive, and there doesn't need to be necessarily a complaint. It might have received a tip off that an organization is conducting improper practices, and I think the intention would be this agency then monitors with powers to fine and potentially prosecute and scrutinize how employers are treating their staff. But unsurprisingly, with a Labour government, we're seeing strengthened trade union law. The Conservative government had introduced the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act in 2023. This was the act that set certain thresholds where a minimum amount of staff in certain sectors, such as transport and at the NHS, had to have a certain amount of staff that would be available if there were to be a strike. This legislative change was massively controversial, not just with the unions, but throughout. It attracted widespread criticism, and it's not surprising that Labour would be seeking to abolish this change. It would also strengthen trade union laws, such as removing the requirement for full postal ballots for industrial action, and it would make it easier for unions to gain recognition by removing the requirement that 40% of those entitled to vote on recognition need to vote in a ballot for it to be valid. So I've spoken about what we can really expect to see from this new employment rights bill, which we think is going to imminently be brought to Parliament. Now, some more sort of horizon scanning. What can we expect to see? Other proposals within the manifesto published before Labour came to power include a simplifying of employment status, a potential reduction in time limits for bringing a claim in the employment tribunal, redundancy consultation and 2P processes strengthened, unpaid internships banned. Again, this has been in the news a lot recently, but proposals for a right to switch off. That's a right that's already in place in France, which actually means there's an actual right for employees not to be contacted improperly by their employer outside of working hours, i.e., you have an actual legislative protection to say, okay, it's now gone 6 p.m. I can take time with my family and not be disturbed. And we've spoken about flexible working already. We're seeing, further changes in this area to do with how a 4-day week and a right to how that might be allowed. So, compressed hours. Also mentioned within the King's Speech was the Draft Equality, Race and Disability Bill. So this will strengthen equality law by enshrining the full right to equal pay for ethnic minorities and disabled people. Currently, an equal pay claim can be brought by a woman on the basis of sex, whereas there's going to potentially be a massive expansion so that if there is a difference between how ethnic minorities or disabled people are paid within an organisation, then there would be an equal pay claim that they can now bring. Further, again, I know large public sector organisations are already introducing mandatory ethnicity and pay reporting, but we're seeing a potential introduction for ethnicity and disability pay for any employers over 250, where they have 250 staff or more. So those are some of the key changes. As we can see, there's some really radical shake-ups happening in employment law. And so you as an employer need to be thinking about how to protect your organization. I think the general theme we can take, not just from Labour proposals, but recent Conservative government changes, which have now been implemented, is there has been a strengthening in employment rights. And whilst, yes, we're in favour of protecting staff and ensuring they are fairly protected, unfortunately for you as employers means the risk of a claim is heightened. So specifically, I think sexual harassment, this new duty which will come into force in a month's time, I think the main takeaway I would give you is what you understand already, but reiterating that. And that is all the steps that you're doing to protect staff from sexual harassment within the workplace. Um, it should not be a box ticking exercise. So it shouldn't just be almost automated yearly mandatory training, which doesn't reflect your organization. It isn't just every year you look at your policy and say, okay, is this working? It needs to go a lot further, and you need to be thinking about, okay, last year we had these employment tribunal claims or these grievances received in this service area. That was a result of this. What can we as an organization do to change things? And that might be through bespoke training for senior managers on how to deal with certain situations. It may be an audit of your policies, thinking about how and whether they reflect current current law and requirements. Um, and in particular, yeah, refresher training, as I mentioned. The other specific action that I would highlight at this point is unfair dismissal may become a day one right. I started to speak about how probation periods may take a special status. And I think it's a fair comment to say that this as a whole, probations aren't often followed that effectively by employers. Um, Quite often, what we see is a drift where an employee, a new starter, may be struggling, may not be achieving performance targets, but rather than setting a clear maybe putting them on a performance improvement plan, maybe giving them specific actions to take forward. Often they pass their approval, and a year down the line, you have an even greater problem where that employee is continuing to not perform. Really, I think my key takeaway is think about your probation policy. It's going to be particularly important moving forward, and have really clear guidance for your managers and ensure that it is consistently followed. If new starters are receiving really good training, they know how to do their role. Their manager is having regular one-to-ones where their performance is monitored and they're given feedback on that performance, and all of this is clearly recorded. Then that day one unfair dismissal risk is going to be massively mitigated. Really, if I could summarize, I'd say you need to grasp the nettle. In this probationary period, you really need to be thinking about, okay, are they performing? If not, what steps should I be taking proactively? Yes, Julie.
I was just going to say, Kit, even if the proposal for a day one employment unfair dismissal right, is watered down, it is really envisaged that the current 2 years will be substantially reduced, and actually that makes sense. There's no requirement for any employer to need 2 years to determine whether somebody's fit for the role. And so we would certainly expect it to be reduced. And we often see that the probation is passed without actually anybody thinking about it. It's just a passage of time. And I think it will be really important to actually just use it and get into good practices now, because you will need that clear formatting, sort of evidence to show what you've done and how you've done it in that short period when someone starts.
Yes, that's completely right. And regardless of whether these new changes were coming in, the points that we've just discussed there, so not a box ticking exercise, really thinking about what you're doing and really, applying a consistent probationary period where you have effective controls in place. These are things that your organization should be doing anyway. Finally, to summarise, so general actions would include now would be a good moment to plan the audit. So I'd give yourself a bit of time. We've got this new sexual harassment duty that comes into force at the end of the next month. Daniel Barnett's telling us it's going to be 2 weeks until the Employment Rights Bill is published. Taken together, now is a really good time for you in your organization to conduct an audit, think about your policies, your procedures, what's working well, what isn't, what do you need to improve. And it's not going to be as simple as there is this new law, we need to reflect the policy to change that. I think now would be a good moment to go further. Are our policies working? Is there something that consistently comes up as an issue that now needs to be addressed? Additionally, training, particularly senior management, it's always key. If your senior managers are struggling, then really they need to be given the support. Frequently, through no fault of their own, managers are in the firing line. They have to take unpopular decisions. I've just said you need to be thinking about probationary periods and strengthening them up. This may mean that your managers are taking increasingly unpopular decisions, and their role is actually they've got greater oversight, and this may attract further complaints and issues from staff where these unpopular decisions are taken. And so it really increases the need for these managers to be well trained, to be recording their actions, to understand why they're doing them. Third, communicating changes to staff. You want to consistently communicate these changes and filter them down through your organization. And fourthly, it's easy for me to sit here and say, continue to promote inclusive culture within your organization, because I know you as your employers are already taking really positive, proactive steps, but you need to continue to do that. Almost every change I've mentioned within this presentation today really strengthens employees' rights. And so if we can ignore the black letter policies, the law, if you as an organization are doing what you can to actually promote staff that feel supported, that aren't afraid to raise complaints and they're dealt with effectively, then you'll be doing what you can to mitigate the risk globally to your organization. So those were the general actions I picked up. Julie, I don't know if you've got anything. Yep.
No, I think that's a really good point at the end, and I think it's really worth noting that most of the people bring employment tribunal claims whilst they remain an employee, because sometimes they disagree with decisions that are taken, but often it comes down to communication. So I think if in terms of the flexible working applications, in terms of prevention against harassment, if you're communicating well, if you're explaining the reasons behind your behaviour, then it's less likely that your staff are going to be disgruntled. They're going to understand the reasons behind the decisions that you're taking, so they're less likely to pursue tribunal claims. I think that there's a couple of questions in the box. The first one's relatively straightforward, so the slides will be sent to delegates after the webinar. In terms of the second one, if changes are placed in front of the Parliament on the 10th of October, do we have a guess how long it'll take to become active? I don't think this is going to be a fast-tracked law by any stretch of the imagination, and there are several stages that it'd have to go through, and I think there'll be quite a lot of pushback in certainly in respect of certain parts. And so I think the average of a normal bill could be up to a year. So I think you're certainly looking probably around the 6-month mark. I could be absolutely wrong, but it is something we're probably looking at the middle of next year at the earliest for royal assent, and then for it to be actually come into play. I don't think there's any other questions. Does anyone have any other questions whilst you have us here in respect of Kit's summary? If not, you obviously know where we are. I think, Kit, do you have a slide with the there you go, with our emails on. So if you do have any questions afterwards, do please come and let us know. We have another Sharp Minds next month. And if you've got any particular topics you'd like us to cover, we would much prefer to do sessions that are bespoke to your needs rather than what we've come up with. But if we don't hear from you, then we will be announcing our topic, and we will be publishing that and letting you all know about it imminently. But unless you've got anything further, Kit, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And thank you, Kit. That was really, really good summary. And I hope to see you all next month, if not before.